This is an opportunity to glorify God even in this process and to maintain that inspiration, knowing that God is in full control. That time of contemplation, of prayerful contemplation and bringing in wise counsel, there's no substitute for that.
Welcome to the Last Service Podcast. I'm your host, Matt. You may have heard that American churches are closing at a pace faster than new churches are opening. In fact, it is estimated that over 4,000 churches will close this year. The need for thoughtful conversations about the declining church in America is more crucial than ever, and I've got some questions. Are these dying churches a tragedy, or is it an inevitable part of a church's life cycle? What happens when a church closes? How do we pastor and lead a dying church? And how can a declining church end well? On this podcast, we explore the stories of American churches that have closed, consolidated, or merged. But this isn't a tale of despair. It's a celebration of good endings, enduring legacies, and the courage to embrace new beginnings. This is not the end. Hey folks, welcome back to the Last Service Podcast. I'm so excited about my guest today, so I can't wait to have this conversation. I've been looking forward to it all week. We have Erika Cole, the church attorney from the Church Law Podcast, on our show today. So I'm so eager to dive in. But first, let's learn a little bit more about you. Tell us about yourself, your family, all that fun stuff.
Yeah, well, again, Matt, thank you so much for having me. I love your vision for this podcast and that you are bringing it to the church community. It's such an important discussion, and I appreciate that your angle is not like we've got to try to fix something that's broken, right? That's not your angle. Your angle is this is a reality. This is the life cycle, as I call it, of church operations. It's natural, and how do we embrace it and share people's stories? So thank you for what you do.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully we can live up to that beautiful summary of what you just said.
So far, so good. Everything I've heard sounds fantastic. So,
well, good. I appreciate that.
As you've said, my name is Erika Cole. I'm known as the church attorney. I'm grateful to be able to provide a podcast. We're in season 6, I guess, and a bit over 2 years. We're on the Christianity Today podcast network, and as you know, podcasting is such an amazing blessing to be able to do. It also is a labor of love at the same time. And we found ourselves at the top 5% global podcasts, and we're talking about church law, right? So
that's incredible.
Yeah, I don't even know. That's just God's grace there. But again, I'm an attorney. My entire career for over 2 decades has focused on the representation of churches, denominations, faith-based organizations. And for me, it's absolutely a calling. It has been a calling. I was the first in my family to finish college and certainly to go to law school, to professional school. And so when I graduated, frankly, I don't know how many people I've told this, but I put on my law school application that I wanted to do family law.
Oh, wow.
Which is like absolutely something I loathe. So it just goes to show that sometimes you don't know what you want to do until you start doing some things. And God will take you down your own proper journey. That certainly has been my testimony. So when I graduated from law school, it was amazing that I was selected among all the graduating class nationwide to clerk for this chief judge of our highest court. And that was a huge blessing. And even beyond that, a case came before the court between a local church and a national denomination.
Ooh.
And I was like, wait a minute. Churches go to court? Like, not my sweet church, not like the sweet church I came from. Like, there's this whole legal side of church. I had no idea, Matt. I was floored, and I asked the judge to assign the case to me so that I could do all the research, so I could look into all the details. And that was the beginning of me as the church attorney. I realized that as a Christian, as a believer, as someone who was raised in the church, who also has this, the blessing of being a practicing attorney, I have insights that the average attorney just doesn't have. I actually got a lot of referrals from attorneys who were like, yeah, we don't know what to do with this, but there's this attorney who does church law, the church attorney, talk to her. So it really was a calling for me. And literally, I have to say, like, God just spoke to me in the night many years ago, and I heard the church attorney, and I didn't know what that meant. Frankly, I didn't know how that I would walk that out, but I did have the wherewithal to reserve the domain name. So
there you go.
So all my branding is intact. I really do.
That's
protect
great.
My branding. Yeah. And it's been a way that people can find the help that they need. And ultimately, that's really the point.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to ask this question as if I knew something about law and legal careers, which I know very little. But what makes being a church attorney, like what is unique about that specialty? Does it lean mostly into contract law? Does it lean mostly into insurance law, business sides, like that kind of stuff? Well,
one of the things that is so interesting, and I was an equity partner at a 200 plus lawyer firm, right? So which means that you've got to have what they call a sizable book of business. That means I had lots of clients and people that I work with, and they were all like, how did you do this? Right? And it's because church law is all the things you've mentioned, right? It is like corporate law, but for churches. So it's all the transactional needs that churches have. So everything from church planting to church growth matters, expansions, building projects, buying and selling property, hiring and firing matters, HR, employment. It's all the things under the umbrella of services provided, legal services that churches need. And one of the big things, as you know, at this day and time that churches need, mergers is one of the top growing areas for churches. And we also know that churches are dissolving at a much greater rate than they are growing, that they are being planted, that new churches are being planted. So these are the kinds of services that a competent attorney with my background is able to help a church walk through. I always say with competence, character, and compassion. Like those are the unique qualities that I believe I bring because I'm competent in this area. It's what I've done for 25 years exclusively, and there just aren't many people who can say that. Character, because I believe that integrity is what we all want to bring to the table as believers. And compassion, because I really do understand I'm a part of the church community.
That's excellent. We'll circle back to those character qualities when we talk about what to look for in an attorney if you need one. But briefly, I want to talk about your podcast for a little bit because it is pretty phenomenal. It has a lot of wonderful things. It's also the gift of brevity, which is something that we lack on this podcast. So I love it. I go and I listen to it, and it's 20 minutes. 30-minute episodes, very pithy on a topic that really matters. But could you just share a little bit about your vision for the podcast, what you hope to accomplish, who you want to listen, that sort of thing?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And honestly, we've pivoted to have sort of more digestible sized episodes. But we try to give people what they want, but I also listen to episodes of podcasts that are 45 minutes, an hour or longer. It just all depends.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so absolutely. I love what you do. And I think that honestly, as a nation, it's probably helpful for us to be able to concentrate for a period of time.
Sure.
I think that in the world of social media, some of that giftedness has evaporated, but I think it is important. So the Church Law Podcast is an opportunity for churches and denominations, faith-based organizations, religious schools, etc., to hear relevant information that is timely and frankly free. So they get to hear information that is necessary for churches and faith-based organizations to be aware of from a legal standpoint, so that they can maybe just be aware of some of the legal issues that are current, as well as maybe have the viewpoint of a professional who is in the weeds every day, to give them some insight of maybe what they can look forward to as they progress in ministry. And also, I'm a sounding board because I hear from our listeners. They ask questions. They tell us what they want to learn more about. So it really is an engaging place where I'm able to communicate with listeners and they're able to communicate with me.
That's fantastic. If you are a church leader and you're listening and you haven't yet, go subscribe to the Church Law Podcast, part of the CT Media Network. It's really fantastic.
Thank you.
All right. I'd like just a little more biographical questions for you. If you're willing to share, I'd love to hear about your church history. If you grew up in a church, we'd love to hear that, what that looks like for you now. And I ask that because, you sort of see the tougher moments, right? Was Paul refers to more of the stuff that we don't want to see all the time. Yeah. But you're also involved in a church yourself.
Yeah. I always say I go behind the curtain, right? So not everybody is prepared for that. But I was raised in the church. So I often tell the story that my mom was my Sunday school teacher. My dad was the head trustee of our church. We were at church all the time. Funny story, something that just happened last week, on the way to church. I believe my husband says, our youngest son asked him, "Dad, did you all go to church as much as we go to church?" And I just thought that was hilarious because awesome. We went to church all the time. Like we had services, pretty much from like 10 o'clock was Sunday school, if I recall correctly. Then 11:15 was our church service. We got out maybe like 1:30, 2 o'clock. Right. And then we had midweek service. We had a dedicated Bible study. We had a dedicated prayer service. And I also sang with the youth choir. So I was at church all the time. And then when I moved to go to law school, this is going to date myself, but I literally drove around with a map in one hand. This is days before Google Maps, right? And my Bible in the other hand, like trying to find a church.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I actually found a fantastic church, and that's where I was literally until I graduated from law school, and even some years after. And then God really put in my heart to go on the mission field. So I went on the mission field for about a year, and then I came back and joined a larger church that I was there, met my husband. We got married, had some kids, and then moved a bit closer because kids, to where we live in Maryland. So that's been my path. I think I've literally only joined 2 churches in my entire life, but I've been in church.
That's beautiful, though.
Forever. So I really believe in the local church. I believe in serving the local church. I believe in giving to the local church. And we go as a family.
If you've been a part of a church closing or merger, I want to hear your story. Reach out to me at lastservicepodcast@gmail.com. We'll schedule a time to talk and see if your testimony could be a source of inspiration for other churches and other church leaders. All right, let's dive into a little more church law topics. So I was just listening to the last episode of your podcast, and you tackled an incredibly difficult topic, which is the issue of sexual abuse and how to protect children. Thank you for doing that, because that's, as we know, something that nobody really wants to deal with. But if we don't, sadly, it can become a problem. Mm-hmm. And we want to, make sure that we're offering that protection. But you shared something that I thought was interesting that I'd love to unpack with you a little bit. You mentioned that if a church doesn't have children and youth, its time is limited. And I think on one hand, we all kind of get that. But I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about that. What has been your experience around that? What have you seen?
Yeah, so we all see the statistics, right? They come from Barna, they come from Pew Research. It's one thing to look at the data, which I find convincing, but sometimes visually we have to look around our church and maybe take an assessment. Are we seeing baby boomers, which is great, and or are we seeing millennials, the generations after them, right? Kids, youth, alpha, maybe.
Yeah, whatever comes Gen Z.
Yeah.
I lost track.
So I feel like sometimes it's important to just take that visual assessment. Are we getting younger people? Are we actively pursuing younger people? And if we're not, just statistically, it doesn't bode for longevity. And so I want to say that in the most sensitive way possible, and also alert churches, because these are things that you don't want to look back later and see where the pit, where the holes were, the potholes, right? You don't want to go over, crash, and then think about what could have been done differently. I really want to try to highlight these issues now so that churches can take note and then make a plan, right? Be strategic about the way that we serve young people and invite them in.
Yeah. And that's no easy task.
No.
I think it's important to recognize it's, going from an aged congregation to suddenly bringing youth does not happen overnight. I mean, I guess what I'm kind of hearing in your response there is the ability for a church to be self-aware and to do that self-assessment work. What do you think prevents churches from being able to do that, either legally or in terms of their attendance and growth?
Yeah, I think that there is a certain level of momentum that is necessary to push something uphill, right? So once you are already struggling with having young people in place, and there's been this sequence, usually, I mean, from my observation, it also means that leadership has aged in place, maybe without the kind of succession plan or forward thinking around what it would look like to pass the baton. So it usually is a part of a larger discussion, has been my experience. So I've seen churches where at one point the boomers were the young people, right? But those people are still, yeah. I mean, that's just how life works.
Yeah.
So things just keep, there's that same momentum, but some people aren't thinking, well, is there a young person I can bring along who can help in this area that I can develop and then pass this on to? They sort of continue doing the same things they've always done. And to their credit, they're often very capable, but sometimes it's not about whether you can do it. It's about whether you're doing it prevents someone else from learning the skill and using their gifts and talents to be able to do it.
All right. Are we ready to dive into the weeds of church closings and mergers?
Let's do it.
All right. So to merge or close an organization, I can say from experience, sadly, it takes a lot longer than most people might think. Could you give us an overview of what has to happen let's start with closing a church, to dissolve an organization? What are the steps that need to happen?
So let me say this first of all, Matt. I completely agree with you that it takes time. I want to, again, just encourage your listeners to do that self-evaluation, right? Because sometimes the writing is on the wall, and the most successful churches in this process, even through the dissolution process that I've seen, is they are taking an analysis of where things are. They are seeing, we're in 2024 and we've got 32 members. And in 2019, we had 172. And in 2014, we had 387. They're doing the analysis to see where things are. And hopefully they're having a conversation with those that remain, right? And sometimes there is the wherewithal there is the spiritual and the, I would say and the natural, right? The spiritual and the natural wherewithal to maybe change the trajectory, but that isn't always the case, and it's not always desirous. So I would say the first thing is maybe take a reflective look to see how we got here, because I do think that that is going to be insightful as you move forward. The next thing I would say is I'm a lawyer, right? So get your legal documents in place. And I do have a checklist that I put together where churches can just sort of go through the checklist and see what documents they have. Things like your articles of incorporation, any amendments or bylaws, any amendments, right? Tax ID number, your letter of determination from the IRS, if you have that. I mean, just go through the checklist and gather your documents.
How often while we're here, how often would you recommend a church go through that checklist?
So that's a really good question. I would say because these are documents that once you have them, in theory, you have them. So I don't know that you need to revisit it particularly frequently, but maybe check it over every couple or 3 years. Your articles of incorporation it's like your birth certificate, right? You're not going to be, about to say you're not going to be born again, but of the spirit, of course.
Right.
But legally. So some of these things, once you have them, you have them. But I do also have a space to include any amendments, and those things can happen periodically. So I would say every 2 to 3 years, perhaps.
Okay, we're going to say that again for the kids in the back. Every 2 to 3 years, check over your articles, your bylaws, go get the checklist and check through it. I mean, at some point, because I don't really dive into this too much into the podcast, but I can tell you all the ones that have closed, like finding those documents involves archaeology half of the time, like Indiana Jones style, going through cobwebs. Well, no one has looked at them.
Yeah, so that's why you hear me saying this up front. Like, just take the time to do this now, because it may take time. So there are some documents that if you don't have them, you can request them from some government entity, right? So every state has a Secretary of State where your articles of incorporation are filed. In general, if you don't have that, you can request it from the Secretary of State. In general, if your church can't find its letter of determination, you can make a request from the IRS. As you can appreciate, these things often don't happen quickly. So it is most advantageous if you have your own documents, but there is a process to gather some of them if you don't have them in your own care. I also think it's important to have things like your deed, right? Because some decision has to be made about the property. Or if you're renting property, then obviously your lease. So again, get the checklist, go through the checklist, gather all the information. So that's the second thing I would say. Thirdly, when it comes to dissolution, it's an unwinding. That's another way that we reference it legally. So unwind means you got to go back, the way that you came, right? So that's why I'm telling you it's important to have these documents in place, because you have to address each of these areas, each of the boxes that you've opened, you got to nicely close them, right? So if you incorporated, then you're going to need to dissolve, and there's a process for that. If you applied for an EIN and you've been using that, then you need to cancel that. If you have tax exempt status, likewise, you need to notify the IRS. So there's this whole process of undoing the things, and that's why it's important to have your documents in front of you. And a big part of it too is, and maybe I would say this is the fourth thing. So the first thing is the evaluation, right? How do we get here? Making the decision that we are dissolving. Number 2 is going through the checklist. Number 3 is actually reviewing, like filing the things that are necessary in order to complete the process. But I would say the fourth part is making that decision of what you're going to do with your assets. Because unlike a for-profit, where if, an LLC, a single member LLC is closing, then whoever that member is going to pay the debts and then pocket the rest, right?
But not here.
That's how we do it. But for nonprofits, for tax exempt organizations, for churches, the IRS has a very distinct and required, may I say, article of dissolution that every tax-exempt organization has to have in its bylaws. And it will tell you what you must do with those resources. And in essence, it needs to be transferred to another tax-exempt entity. And so there's a whole process that you're going to likely undergo and need some support to make sure that that transition happens properly.
So let's talk about mergers now. And this is a loaded question because mergers means it's kind of a dizzying term. First of all, in your mind, how does a merger differ from a closing?
So let me say this. I do think that churches are starting to warm up to the concept of a merger. I recognize that mergers, began as this very, I don't want to call it Wall Street, but very much a for-profit concept.
Sure.
But mergers, I was interviewed earlier this week, in fact, and I'm talking with several other church leaders about mergers and their importance. So I think that we are coming to the place where we recognize that this is a significant tool that churches can use and should consider, in my humble opinion. So I did write a guide, the Church Attorney's Guide to Mergers, because I just found that, honestly, there wasn't a lot of information for churches on this topic, and I want churches to be prepared. That's very much my heart. So I provide this instructional guide really step by step on how to move forward in a merger. So I'm going to answer the question first of how does a merger differ from a closing, and then respond to your question about what the process is. If that's okay. So a closing or a dissolution in general it's the finality of the entity. And that aside from needing to ensure that its assets or any of its finances or the building, all of those things are accounted for in that process of unwinding. It's final in that regard. A merger brings together, by definition, two or more legal entities, and there are various ways the merger can reflect at the end of the day. But in its most simple way, it's bringing together two or more entities to continue on, right? That's the whole point, to continue on. So that's the most significant distinction, is that in a dissolution, it is an ending, it is a termination, and a merger is a continuation, but generally under a different legal status, maybe a different name, in a different way.
So sometimes, and the reason I asked that was merger, the term gets a little muddled because I think there is a way that we can do what I might call a spiritual merger, in which the two congregations blend in terms of the people attending, but legally it's a closure and it's a dissolution, and then they just transfer over assets to the other legal entity. Yes. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, and I give several examples actually in the book about the types of mergers, because there's not one way to do it. And it really does take some evaluation between how the congregations, really what's in their best interest. So, for example, I had a fantastic merger that was between the two oldest synagogues in the state.
Oh, wow.
And they had a lot of history and some particular assets that they wanted to hold on to. So managing that scenario might be different than a scenario where I've done mergers where there's a church that has a huge property, but very few in the congregation, and then a church that's like, we're busting at the seams with people, but we don't have the building, right? So that can be really a match made in heaven. So there are different ways that mergers can happen based on, going back to point number one, doing that checklist, what are we bringing to the table? Because you got to have that analysis to know what's really going to work for you.
Right. Okay. Walk us through the process of a merger.
So it's interesting. Again, you're going to want, I love when you reference the spiritual merger. I do want to just start with a quick caution to say, a merger may not always be the right thing, right?
Right.
So you may find that maybe in the scenario where there's two smaller congregations, they decide that they want to fellowship together, which I think you kind of reference as a spiritual merger. They may decide that we will come together for spiritual reasons, for support. There may be ways that they can share space. Like literally, I've prepared what's called a space sharing agreement. Like they come together to share in that regard. That's not a merger, and that's okay. There may be scenarios where it makes sense for the organizations, let's say that they don't necessarily have the services together, but there's a building and they really, it's underutilized. So they may want to allow other congregations or another congregation fellowship there when they're not using the building, right? So that kind of lease arrangement. So there are different things that can happen other than a merger. So I just want to put that out there as well.
Sure,
there are other options to consider if a merger doesn't make sense. But if we decide that a merger is the right next thing to do, then we want to have that discussion around where do we align as congregations spiritually, because I think that is a critical component. Where do we align spiritually? Where do we align as relates to our goals? Some churches are very international focused. Some churches are more like local community focused. They're different passions, I think I would say. And I would say even God-led passions for various churches. So you want to make sure that you kind of get on the same page there, make sure that you're really on the same path. And then you want to make sure that I think that you engage someone who can be neutral to help you walk through the process. I don't think that mergers have to feel like someone's the boss of someone else. I don't think I can't imagine that would feel good. And I don't think that has to be how it's handled. There may be a congregation, an organization that has more assets, maybe more people, maybe a larger footprint. But we know that spiritually, we are all equal, right? God loves us all. We all have the same mission in general, in terms of winning the lost. So it should not feel like a scenario where, again, for lack of a better example, there's a David and Goliath, right? So it really is a matter of coming together, almost like I think of my husband and me, right? So when we came together 17 years ago, we put everything together because that's what it means to merge. So looking at those assets, bringing them together, and engaging someone who can help you walk through the process, and then ultimately evaluating what are the strengths, relative strengths of the parties who are there, and how can we all benefit from those strengths. And then there's the legal component that we've talked about, where somebody's got to manage all that paperwork, right? Because it's a lot. And I want to respond to something that you said about the timeliness. Yeah. I would say churches should give themselves no less than 2 years to go through this process. And I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but I would say no less than 2 years. And the pastors that I was on this panel with earlier this week, one of their churches, I want to say it took them 10 years. In another church, it was like 40 years. It was like a wilderness experience.
Wow.
So that's why I'm saying no less than 2 years. And that really, you're going to be using all the time in those 2 years. But if it's something that you feel a flutter, like this could be something right for our church, then I would explore it sooner rather than later.
And that speaks back to what we said a few minutes ago about cultivating the ability and the practice of being self-aware and doing self-assessments, because it's, I don't know why, but this does seem to sneak up on congregations. Yeah. And then the options are limited when you have 6 months of cash left and no pastor, right? That's what we want to avoid.
Yeah.
So better to start sooner.
Well, and can I just say one other thing there?
Sure.
The importance too of gathering your documents and having someone who can help you analyze your situation is critical, because I've found that some churches don't have clarity about even who the decision maker / makers are.
Okay, I'm glad you pointed that out. Yeah.
Yeah.
What you mean by clarity is the bylaws say something different than how they've been practicing for years, and no one knew.
Ta-da.
Right?
Ta-da.
Which isn't like anything shady. It's just something that happens, right?
Exactly.
So then the bylaws have to be changed to reflect how decisions get made so that you can make the decision to move forward with a closure or merger.
So I have a whole dedicated chapter about key decisions for a sound merger. And the very first line is, who makes the merger decision? And it's critical to be clear about that, because I've seen situations, unfortunately, where the leader who thinks they're decision maker makes the decision, and then the other fraction is like, no, we should have been involved in this process, and then it becomes a whole thing. So this is why I'm saying doing the analysis early and upfront is going to be to your ultimate benefit.
In the episode that will have aired prior to this one, we talk about the stages. And the first one that this particular guest mentions is the stage of quiet wondering. And I love that, but I also wish it wasn't quiet, right? We need to be okay with the wondering what's going to happen so that we can look at ourselves objectively and look at options. And then we can be more creative about options. Yeah. And then this becomes something much more, I don't want to say fun necessarily, but we have so much more room to work and to pray about it and to come up with solutions and to seek good counsel and help.
That's right.
So it's that stage is crucial for getting things right.
That's right. I think it's just like anything, that is a serious decision. That time of contemplation, of prayerful contemplation, and bringing in wise counsel, there's no substitute for that.
I hope you're enjoying this episode of the Last Service podcast. Hey, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you can stay updated for upcoming episode. Okay, that's all. Back to the story. When things get delayed a little bit, often what's happening is churches are pretty much led by volunteers, or, a bivocational pastor at that point. So they're tired emotionally, sometimes physically they're tired from having to keep up with a church, and all the maintenance goes with the building. And so they're, maybe not in the best frame of mind to tackle difficult topics, which they're, naturally not an expert in. They're going to lean on a lawyer in their personal network. But let's try to put some other options out there. What should, other than somebody's best friend or somebody's, sister or brother or something, what should a church be looking for in an attorney to help them either close or merge?
So first, let me say, even though I think the engagement of legal counsel along this path is ideal, if not inevitable, some churches make the decision to work with a consultant on the front end to sort of help them be a part of the think tank, to help them consider maybe what some of their spiritual solutions might be. Some denominations have this built into their operations, right? So I've worked with denominations. I mean, as we know, sometimes denominations just close down.
That's a different episode. We'll have to do.
That's a whole episode.
Yeah,
sorry, didn't mean to on that. But I'm saying I've also seen situations where denominations, again, have that built-in support to help churches come together. So if you have that built-in support, I would say lean into it. If you don't, you want to make sure, number one, you're looking for someone that this isn't their first rodeo, that they have done any number of mergers, consolidations, dissolutions, like they have a strong background in this area. And I would say secondarily, ideally, this experience is in the church and or nonprofit world, because it really is different when you're dealing with tax-exempt organizations. And thirdly, I would say, if at all possible, that person has the spiritual wherewithal to speak into this situation. I know that these three components are, I'm not saying that they're a dime a dozen. I am saying that it is optimal. And the way that I have shared this, as I think I mentioned before we got started, to me, the way that I've cultivated it to try to describe who I endeavor to be in this space is, I start with competence, because the person has to know what they're doing, right? I love that you love Jesus, but you got to understand what's going on here. And then character, right? That they are reliable, that they're a person of integrity. And then compassion, meaning that they have a sense, they're able to care about this process and your church going through this process. So,
is there a network of attorneys who specialize in this work that we could link or tap into? Are you the only church attorney? You're not the only church. You're the church attorney.
Yeah, I am the church attorney. It's a registered mark. It's official.
Right.
But it's interesting. I have endeavored, and I think I've had some level of success of bringing together and training other attorneys. So excellent. I have the church attorney masterclass where I walk them through a series of processes, because frankly, I want to be able to send churches to a place where it's like, if this is not something that I can handle, right? Because there's I don't know. I was about to make up a number about how many churches there are, but there's a lot. Right. And so I obviously can't work with every one of them. So I like to be able to have those reliable resources. So I just found that if I've trained them, that I feel comfortable saying, okay, this is the work that they need. So I'm really building that resource as I go along.
Oh, I love that. That's fantastic. Your feedback means the world to me. Would you please take a moment and leave a review on your preferred podcast platform? It's going to help us grow, and we'll reach more listeners who might benefit from these conversations. Thanks so much. We are going to link in your website, of course, into our show notes and the other resources that you've mentioned. So in our final minutes here, I would love to hear from you in the best way. It's kind of an unfair question, but I always love to hear what people say. What does a good and faithful church ending look like to you?
What does a good and faithful church ending look like to me? So I think the first thing I would say is it looks intentional. It looks like there's been an intentional process, that there has been, the church didn't just sort of come to a screeching halt. I'm just envisioning dust flying everywhere, Can you tell I'm a country girl at heart? Like so that's what I'm envisioning there. Right. So it's intentional. The second, again, I've been around too many pastors this week, so, everything has to have alliteration. It's also done with insight, right? This looks like ensuring that all the parties that should be at the table are at the table. It looks like that the voices are heard and are uttered in a peaceful way, in a caring way. It looks like that the necessary counselors are present to provide the wisdom and insight that's necessary. So it's intentional, it's insightful. And then the third thing I would say is it is able to inspire. So there is still inspiration there. There's still hope there. There is still the recognition that for whatever time God had this church operating, it completed its mission.
Well said. Erika Cole, thank you so much for being on the Last Service podcast. This was a delight. Wonderful information and insight. Great conversation.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for your time. Any final thoughts?
No, I just want to say thank you again for the invitation. And I just want to encourage your listeners as you take this journey to strongly take hold to what I think you share, Matt, which is that this is an opportunity to glorify God even in this process, and to maintain that inspiration, knowing that God is in full control, and life, life will go on. It may look different, but we continue forward until we reach that eternal hope.
And God is with us through all of it.
Through all of it.
Amen. Thank you for listening to the Last Service podcast. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Erika Cole, the church attorney. Here are my 3 key takeaways from this episode. Number 1, cultivate a culture of self-assessment and evaluation at your church. This will help you recognize signs of decline early and give you a healthy amount of time to weigh options and end well, or find a path to revitalization. Number 2, find your church's vital legal documents and review them every 2 years. Think of this like we would with our own personal vital documents. We have to know where they are before making any important decisions. This will also help keep you in compliance with your church's own decision-making policies. Number 3, Erika's love for the church shines throughout our conversation. Look for an attorney who has experience in nonprofits and churches, not just businesses and contracts. Find someone with competence, character, and compassion to guide your church with wise counsel as you face the end of your life cycle and look to a merger or closure. Those are my 3 takeaways for this episode. I hope this episode brought you wisdom, inspiration, and peace. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our podcast and stay updated on upcoming episodes. Please take a moment to leave a review. It helps us grow and reach more listeners who might benefit from these conversations. If you have been a part of a church closing or consolidation, I want to hear your story. Reach out to me at lastservicepodcast@gmail.com. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. This is not the end.